In the early 1800s, the southeastern lands of the United States were home to thriving native nations. Forests stretched wide, rivers fed towns, farms grew corn and beans, and communities lived by laws older than the republic that now surrounded them. Among them were the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, nations with governments, schools, written languages, and treaties signed in good faith with the United States. But land has a way of erasing promises. As American settlers pushed westward, hunger for land grew louder than the treaties meant to protect it. Cotton had become king, gold had been discovered, and the idea that native people could coexist alongside white settlers was no longer convenient. It was inconvenient. By 1830, the pressure reached Washington. That year, the U.S. government passed the Indian Removal Act, championed by President Andrew Jackson. On paper, the law spoke in careful language. It promised relocation, compensation, and protection. It framed removal as voluntary, humane, necessary for progress. In reality, it was an ultimatum. Native nations were told they must leave their ancestral homelands east of the Mississippi River and relocate to unfamiliar territory in what is now Oklahoma. If they refused, state governments would strip them of legal rights, seize their land, and allow settlers to take what they wanted by force. The Cherokee Nation resisted. They had reason to believe the law was on their side. They had adopted a written constitution. They had schools, farms, newspapers. They appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1832, they won. The court ruled that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. The decision should have ended the matter. It didn't. President Jackson reportedly dismissed the ruling. Federal protection never came. State militias moved in. Settlers crossed borders with impunity. Homes were burned. Livestock stolen. Families threatened. Then came the soldiers. In 1838, under orders from the federal government, U.S. troops began rounding up Cherokee families at gunpoint. Men, women, children, and elders were forced from their homes with little warning. They were allowed to carry almost nothing. Whatever they left behind, houses, fields, possessions, was taken or destroyed. Families were herded into stockades, crowded wooden enclosures surrounded by guards, where disease spread quickly and food was scarce. Children cried for parents lost in the chaos. Elders collapsed from exhaustion. Summer heat turned the air heavy and foul. Many died before the journey even began. Then the march started. The Cherokee were divided into detachments, groups forced to travel hundreds of miles on foot, wagon, or riverboat. The journey stretched across seasons, and as autumn faded into winter, conditions worsened. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Snow froze bare feet. Rivers swelled, forcing people to cross in bitter cold. Food ran out. Rations promised by the government were late, spoiled, or never arrived. People boiled leather, chewed roots, ate whatever they could find. Disease followed them: dysentery, measles, pneumonia, cutting through the camps with merciless speed. Every mile took something: a child too weak to walk, a mother collapsing beside the road, an elder wrapped in a blanket and buried without ceremony because the group could not stop. Some days dozens died, and the living were forced to keep moving. The suffering was not accidental. It was the result of neglect layered on cruelty. Guards pushed the sick forward. Delays were punished. Compassion was rare. The road allowed no pauses for grief. This was not a single trail, but many, routes stretching across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. Yet history would remember them by one name: the Trail of Tears. By the time the Cherokee reached their assigned land in the West, an estimated 4,000 were dead, nearly a quarter of their people. Other nations suffered similar fates. The Choctaw called their removal a trail of tears and death, decades before the Cherokee March gave the phrase its lasting name. But the loss was more than numbers. Languages were silenced mid-sentence. Sacred places were abandoned forever. Knowledge tied to rivers, forests, and mountains was severed from the land that gave it meaning. Survivors arrived not just exhausted, but hollowed, alive, yet carrying the weight of everything they had been forced to leave behind. And still, the story was not over, because survival did not mean peace. What awaited them in the West was not refuge, but another beginning carved from grief. One that would test whether a people broken by distance and death could still remain a people at all. The trail had ended, but the consequences were just beginning. The road finally ended, but there was no relief, no celebration, no sense of arrival, only silence, broken by coughing, by crying, by the sound of people realizing that the land beneath their feet was not home, and never would be. The survivors stepped into unfamiliar territory, with bodies weakened by hunger and disease. The ground was different. The rivers did not carry the same stories. The forest did not answer in familiar ways. What the government called Indian Territory was supposed to be a fresh start. In reality, it was a place of exhaustion, grief, and unfinished mourning. Thousands arrived sick. Many arrived alone. Entire families had vanished along the trail, reduced to memories carried by those who kept walking. Some could not even remember where their dead were buried. There were no markers, no graves worth returning to. The trail had scattered the past across hundreds of miles. Winter came quickly. Shelter was scarce. Supplies promised by the government arrived late, or not at all. People built rough cabins from whatever materials they could find, often without proper tools. Food shortages continued. Disease did not stop simply because the march had ended. It followed them into the camps, claiming more lives long after the walking ceased. For many, the West became a second graveyard. But even here, something refused to die. The people endured, not because the suffering stopped, but because giving up would have meant losing the last thing they still possessed, their identity. Councils were held again. Languages were spoken again. Songs were whispered at first, then sung aloud. Elders taught children stories of the old land so they would not be erased by distance. Mothers named babies after those who had died, refusing to let memory disappear. Survival became an act of resistance. The United States had believed removal would solve a problem, that by scattering native nations, it could absorb the land and forget the people who once lived there. But forgetting proved harder than expected, because the nations did not vanish. They rebuilt governments, they rebuilt schools, they rebuilt families. Broken, yes, but still alive. And that survival came at a terrible cost. The Trail of Tears was not a tragic accident of history. It was not an unavoidable byproduct of expansion. It was a deliberate policy, enforced by law, backed by military power, and justified by the belief that one group's progress mattered more than another's existence. This truth is uncomfortable. That is why it was softened in textbooks, reduced to a paragraph, framed as relocation rather than expulsion, as conflict rather than suffering, as something unfortunate, but necessary. But necessity does not bury children in unmarked graves, and progress does not excuse silence. For decades, the story of the Trail of Tears lived mostly in native memory, passed down through oral histories, family stories, and songs of mourning. Only later did the broader nation begin to confront what had been done in its name. Even today, the consequences remain. Land once taken was never fully returned. Trauma did not end with the final step of the march. It echoed forward, through generations who inherited grief they never personally experienced, but still carried. Displacement reshaped economies, health, culture, and identity in ways that cannot be measured by numbers alone. And yet, despite everything, the nations endured. The Cherokee still exist. The Choctaw still exist. The Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole still exist. They speak, they govern, they remember. The Trail of Tears failed in its ultimate goal. It did not erase a people. It revealed something else instead. That survival itself can be a form of defiance, and memory can be stronger than power. Today, parts of the trail are marked, not as tourist routes, but as reminders. Quiet roads, forest paths, river crossings, places where footsteps once fell heavy with grief. These markers do not bring back what was lost, but they ask something of those who passed them, to acknowledge, to remember, to refuse the comfort of forgetting. Because history does not disappear when it is ignored. It waits, and it returns. Whenever a nation decides whose lives matter, whose land is expendable, and whose suffering can be explained away as progress. The Trail of Tears is not just a story about the past. It is a warning, A warning about what happens when power speaks louder than humanity, when laws are written without conscience, when distance allows cruelty to feel abstract. The road may have ended in the 1800s, but the responsibility to remember it did not. If this story mattered to you, if it made you pause, or feel, or question, then help keep it alive, even when the places themselves were gone. Identity survived not because it was protected, but because it was defended by those who refused to let it fade. The Trail of Tears attempted to sever a people from their past. Instead, it bound that past permanently to their future. And today, when we speak its name, we are not just recounting a tragedy. We are deciding whether it will be remembered as a warning